Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, collector, bookseller, all-round general good guy and the voice of experience in SF on the old YouTube. So what are we doing today? Today I want to talk about was it a failed revolution? I want to talk about a revolution, and it wasn't really a failed revolution. I guess in a way it was a revolution which never really got off the ground, and it was a revolution that happened or didn't happen, depending on your point of view, in Britain, which is why of course I'm wearing a t-shirt with the USA on it, just to be perverse about things. And you're probably wondering, why have I got a copy of this very, very handsome book by Colin Greenland, Other Voices, published by Unwin Hyman back in the 80s, on the podium? Well, that will become clear. Today we're going to talk about the gene rats. And if you don't know who the gene rats are, I'm not surprised, because if you try and Google it, nothing will come up. Because I did try, because I'm working from memory on this, and I don't have the original sources, but we'll come on to that. So we're going to talk about something specifically British with SF from the 1980s. Before we do that, I thought we'd do a little recent acquisitions just to update you on what my book buying activities have been of late. And there will probably be 1-2 Bookhaul videos to come. I think I have some stuff coming from Andy at Cold Tonnage, and he's back from his holidays in Lanzarote. Hope you had a nice time, Andy. And I will probably get some things when I go to Zardos, probably just a few paperbacks. Trying to rein you in a bit because Christmas is coming, the Fewables are coming and what have you. You can't keep doing book hauls no matter how much you lot love them. And maybe there'll be something where I look at what I've got from work for myself in the last sort of couple of months of the year, but we'll see. Anyway, what have I acquired recently? Well, let's have a quick look before we go on to the main topic of today's video, the gene rats. So, first of all, anybody who's watched the channel for a long time will know that I have a bit of a thing about Seven House SF, and as you can see, this is Greg Bear, Beyond Heaven's River, in Seven House, one of his early novels, and I haven't even unwrapped this. This is so nice. I'm tempted to leave it in there. And as I say, I do own a copy of this in paperback, and it's somebody, I think it's about I seem to recall it's a Japanese soldier in World War II, or rather an aviator, I think, and I'm not sure if he's a kamikaze. And as it says in the front, moments from death he was thrust into eternal life. So we shall see. But isn't that beautiful? Lovely octavo format. And basically, I'm only short of one of the 4. I think Seven House did 4 of Bear's early novels. I'm short of Strength of Stones, which is really hard to find, really uncommon book, especially in good nick. So that's the sort of last on my list. So I was pleased to get that. So I'm going to pop that on the podium, and then we'll come back to this because the mystery will build up, which I know you love. So that's that. So I'm sort of like to expand my Greg Bear collection. Really, he's not a writer I always click with, but there are quite a few I haven't read which I want to read from the early period, and it's sort of very much a nostalgia thing. I'm sort of thinking more and more about the 80s and things again, which for me, as I've said before, was a really great period early in my career as a bookseller. So that's Beyond Heaven's River. Continuing in this theme, I have another Bear, and this is one I used to sell a lot in trade paperback, and my memories of it are more of the trade paperbacks than the A format paperbacks, because this is a diptych, a 2-volume series, and this is a fantasy series by Greg Bear, and this is the first of the 2, and this is the Infinity Concerto. As you see, it's in Century Fantasy and SF. So this is before Century launched Legend as the imprint of Arrow, which was Century Hutchinson's paperback imprint, and then they had Legend within it, and they have this rather nice plain blue and yellow livery, which I really love, and I love that cover. And I used to sell this in trade, as I say, and these came out in the UK after Blood Music and Eon, which were the real big bestsellers, in which I was sort of part of the publishing process, or I nearly became part of it when I advised Pan to buy them and they didn't, and the bids were won by Century Hutchinson. So It's this one there. I've never actually read this. There is a second volume called The Serpent Mage, and they're very hard to come by. I'm very much a first volume guy with fantasy, but as it's only a diptych, I really should try and get the other one. So I'm pleased to get that because that was lovely nick as well. So I'm going to replace that on the podium so you can feast your eyes upon it. There we go. And I'm going to move this one over to my right shirt and stack it up in front of the old naked text blocks, which I know drive a lot of you to despair, but it is what it is. So that's the Infinity Concerto. So a couple of Greg Bears, great stuff. And I will have more Greg Bear coming. So there we go. Something I meant to buy for ages and ages, as I do like his work. And this is not an uncommon book. It's out there a lot, and I really love the artwork. And it's Golanc's from '96, and this is Gregory Benford, Matter's End, which is short stories. And I do love Greg's work in the short form. I really like the original novella of If the Stars Were Gods, which he co-wrote with Gordon Eklund, of course. And look at that, you can't beat it. Spaceship on the cover, red and yellow, absolutely lovely. So I picked these up recently. These are all firsts, of course. Generally, I don't buy a book if it's a reprint unless it's, you know, a classic or a modern classic that's gone into a special reissue. So there you go. So that's Greg Benford, Beyond Heaven's River. And again, we'll do the old swapsy thing, which is nice. There we are. Isn't that beautiful? So, and Greg goes over there. So what else have I had recently? Well, a couple more things before we launch into the main topic, and I'm keeping you in suspense. And I finally received my copy of Zathique, The Final Cycle, in Hippocampus Press, trade paperback. And I had to order this online because it's not distributed in the UK. And I've got a copy of Dark Eidolon, but my old copy of The Emperor of Dreams, the Golanc's one, that's gone somewhere. I must have gone to clear out. And we should get rid of these things. You want to reread them. And if you're a Jack Vance fan and you've never read the Zathique stories, you should, because these are like the original Dying Earth stories, and they're really florid and really good and poetic. Huge influence. And you know, this guy was kind of the new weird guy before there was a new weird. He was one of the original weirds, back with Weird Tales magazine, with Lovecraft and what have you, lived in California. And these are great, and I haven't read them for years. So this is really good. And they do another one. They do the Averion sequence, which is more sort of like medieval type fantasy thing. So I must get that as well. Very, very nice. So that's great. Lovely. Nice trade paperback. But I'm going to move that over and leave Greg there, because Greg, you know, deserves a bit of fealty, I think. So that's that. So that's my sort of fantasy pick there, alongside the second of those bears. Finally, out of new stuff I've sort of acquired recently, is this very beautiful book. I got this from a dealer in Cheltenham, and it's very uncommon in the UK, and I don't know if it's ever published over here. I've got a feeling it wasn't. And that's Implied Spaces by Walter John Williams. And as you can see, there's a Saracen type looking chap here in a very sort of space opera type setting. He's got a little cat there as well, which is nice. And isn't that fantastic? And this is a royal, as you can see, and it's Nightshade Books. You do some beautiful stuff, Nightshade. The Tom Toner's books in the States, and very, very nice indeed. First edition, quarter bound, just a little quarter there. And I think this one might be signed as well. Is it signed? Yes, and it's signed by the man himself. Let's get the glare factor. The glare factor here. Very nice day today, so it's very bright in the house as usual. And I've got a few things signed by Williams, and I am going to go back to him soon. And this is supposed to be, I guess, what the kids today would call a mashup. But it says it's a sword and singularity novel, so that'll be interesting. And it's got some nice brags on the back from Werner Vinge, or Vingy, whatever you want to call him. Charles Stross, who I do like now and again, and S.M. Sterling, who I've never read. So there we go. So Implied Spaces. I actually love that title, and a very handsome book. Couldn't resist it. So that is now going to go onto the podium in Pride of Place, and we're going to move Gregory off. So there you go, Implied Spaces. Isn't that nice? Really, really good. So what are we actually talking about today? Well, back in the early 80s in the UK, there was sort of like a dearth of sort of SF magazines, and New Worlds obviously had been the big thing. It had first started initially before the war, and then it came back after the war. It sort of went up and down a bit. There was Carnell, there was Moorcock. You know, there were all the issues with New Worlds in the 60s, early 70s, the changes of format, different publishers, the problems that Mike had keeping it going and things. And, you know, it sort of pretty much sort of died out. And then there were a few other magazines popped up late 70s. In the early 80s, a group of people got together, including David Pringle, Simon Ounsley, Ross Caveney, a few others, and they started a magazine called Interzone. Now, of course, Interzone was entitled thus after the international zone in Tangier, where William Burroughs wrote some of Naked Lunch and his other books. So it was a direct reference to Burroughs and his influence over New Wave SF. We can talk about that in another video when I do more New Wave stuff. So when Interzone first appeared, the first issue had people like Moorcock, Ballard, Angela Carter, and it was very solid sort of New Wave, post-New Wave sort of thing. But the sort of editorial collective gradually dropped away. And I think after about 6-7 issues, it was just down to David Pringle, who's a great guy, Ballard's archivist, of course, and like myself, a contributor to Deep Ends, except David gets something in every issue, and he's a lovely chap. And he sort of took Interzone on, and he sort of rerun with it. And I used to buy it all the time then. I bought it for quite a few years, every issue, because it had some really good non-fiction, good sort of reviews. There was a wonderful sort of film column called Mutant Popcorn by a guy called Niccolo, I seem to remember. And it was a good magazine, and it was sort of big sort of size. It was too small in circulation to ever win a Hugo or anything, but of course it was UK based. There were lots of international writers popped up in it. Lots of people had their debuts in it, and it was something to watch at the time. And at that point, sort of mid to late 80s, obviously I'd started my career as an SF bookseller, or as a bookseller, doing lots of SF. And it was an exciting time. We had the cyberpunk thing happening, lots of great stuff from the States. A lot of my heroes like Ballard and Priest were sort of doing some really amazing work. So it was a great time. There's lots of really good stuff, and I was on fire for it then. And it was just wonderful. And as I say, there were sort of international people who would pop up in it. So there were people like Michael Blumlein, this is his novel The Movement of Mountains, and he was a doctor. And I remember reading, he had a story in Interzone which was called something like Tissue Ablation. I'll try and put it up on the screen. And The Brains of Rats was the title of his short story collection. He was very Burroughsian, but obviously very hard science as well, So he was one example, and he was from San Francisco. You had people tangential, like this is a sort of few years in, and this is something I just dug out, and this is from 92. This is the debut novel from the Australian writer Paul Veermans, and this is And Disregards the Rest, which is quite a bonkers book, and he did a few things, and I think he had some stuff in Interzone. Forgive me if he didn't, but he seemed to come into my mind with this tranche of sort of people. And there you go, great title, and as you see, the brain is in the shape of Australia, so quite flaky stuff. And you also had wonderful American writers like Scott Bradfield. Hey Scott, whose channel I urge you to watch because it's inspiring and it's fun, and Scott's a great guy, great writer, very witty, and incredibly well-read man. I do hope we get to meet one day Scott. I know we sort of communicated a lot online and stuff and referenced each other. And some of Scott's stories, this is an early new and collected stories volume called Greetings from Earth. This dates from the early 90s, I think. And Scott used to write some SF, big SF fan, and he had some stories in there as well. So he was somebody as well I was aware of. But really, Interzone was fantastic at showcasing new British writers who, really didn't have a venue to get their short fiction out there. And after the sort of rise and establishment of people like Ballard, Priest, and then we move on into some people like Guy Courth, Robert Holdstock, Christopher Evans. We get into the 80s. You always need some new blood to keep the old guys on their toes, and also to sort of bring fresh ideas into the genre and keep it revolving and evolving. And by revolving, I mean in revolution, because SF is a revolutionary and evolutionary genre and needs to move forward. Now, all this, of course, happened just before or round about the time of the beginning of the new radical hard space opera thing. And you've heard me talk before about Ian M. Banks and how for years before Consider Phlebas, there were no space operas published in the UK. And as far as I was concerned, that was a really good thing, because they sort of kept things held back in the 1930s mode. So we really needed sort of, fresh blood. The new wave guys were dominant, and these new guys came through. And somebody who I really like from that period is Colin Greenland. So again, we're going to put Colin back on the podium and talk about him. Now, Colin's first book is a marvellous book, which I do have here somewhere. It's tucked away behind a load of boxes, and I do show it in one of my shelf tours, the one where I show some of my non-fiction. And this book is called The Entropy Exhibition, The New Wave in British SF. It was published by Routledge. And it was basically his dissertation, and Colin sort of argued about how important the new wave was. He focused on Ballard and Moorcock and Brian Aldiss to a degree. And he's a good guy, and he wrote 3 of these fantasy novels for Unwin, which are very ornate, they are connected, they're subtle, they're really beautiful and literary. And I've never met him, but he's obviously a really cool guy. He also did a book-length interview with Michael Moorcock in the 80s called Death is No Obstacle, which is really cool. And somewhere I have a DVD of him doing sort of an Institute of Contemporary Arts interview with Mike about his work. You know, they're being very serious and literary, so it's great fun. But yeah, really great. And he did those. And as I say, this was sort of round about the time just before Banksy did consider Phlebas, and that sort of changed everything. And it, you know, that really excited people because Banks had had a bestseller, The Wasp Factory. He pulled some other novels which had SF elements and were a bit surreal out of his bottom drawer, got them published. And you know, there was a young generation who wanted SF that was more traditional, which wasn't what I wanted at all. I wasn't happy about this at all, even though I bought and read Consider Phlebas. Wish I kept it because it was a first. It's worth a bomb now, but you live and you learn. Still, there you go. So Colin there, he was sort of strangely, he was connected to this because when was this? This was his first proper SF novel. It was just a few years later. So I am talking nonsense. We'll go back there, but I'll just show it you quickly and we'll come back to it. This was Colin's first SF novel, Take Back Plenty, which was originally published as a trade paperback by Unwin. That's the true first edition. In the States was a hardcover. So that was one of the early sort of space operas from that renaissance there as well. But more importantly, what Colin did in one issue of Interzone, and I can't pin down which issue it was, I haven't done the research, I do apologise, you can try and find it yourselves, I will ask David Pringle about it, but Colin said that maybe what was needed, because there was this new generation, was a new tag, a new name for this group of writers who were coming up, and the name he came up with was Gene Rats, from Gene Rat Generation, Gene Rat, and also because the life sciences really seemed to be a major thing in a lot of their writing. One or two of them were biologists, like Blumlein, who I think was a medical doctor, and Paul Macaulay, who was a biologist. So there seemed to be a hard science thing coming. So he said, you know, we need a new name for this new school of bright young SF authors coming up. And why not call ourselves Gene Rats? Because of course the cyberpunk thing was happening in the States. And, you know, writing is a commercial business. People want to make a living from it if they can. And why not? It's better than working for a living. I can tell you that. And, you know, the thing is that they felt maybe they needed to market themselves. And he came up with this, but it never, ever caught on. So Gene Rats never caught on. It's kind of like wiped from SF history. It was an inventive but not particularly meaningful label as far as I was concerned. What did these writers have in common? Well, we'll have a look at their work and we'll see if we can pin something down. So, preeminent amongst them, the first one who really sort of made a splash and got a book deal and what have you, was a chap called Eric Brown. Now, Eric Brown has done loads of books, and he wrote a story called The Time-Lapse Man, and his first book was called The Time-Lapse Man and Other Stories, which was a hardcover from Drunken Dragon, and I think it was a pan paperback. And he was the sort of like first new writer into Zone to really sort of get people excited. And his work is quite gentle. I would say it falls somewhere between the lighter works of Gary Kilworth and say some of Michael G. Coney's stuff. And he was a big fan of Michael Coney. And, you know, it's nice stuff, but it never really blew me away. Having said that, I have read about 7 or 8 of his books, and he's done all sorts of things. He really has, and he keeps sort of doing stuff. He does a lot of novellas for small presses like Newcon and PS, and obviously a good guy. This is one of my favourites by him, and this is The Extraordinary Voyage of Jules Verne. And this is a PS one, as you see, with an introduction by Ian Watson, and it's just like a little Vernian novella, and I thoroughly enjoyed this. It was great, so that's a nice little one. But, you know, Eric's a real sort of like standard sort of SF guy. You know, he does all the sort of tropes and stuff. And as I say, he's very readable and very pleasant, very enjoyable. But he never really blew me away in the way that some of the new wave guys did. So, you know, he was the first to break out, and he's kept producing stuff, so good for him. And like I said, I've read quite a few of his books, actually, so he must have something for me to keep going back to him. Here's another one. This is A Writer's Life. And as you see, this is an A format paperback, and it's a DOS chapbook because it's got The Human Factor by Ken MacLeod on the back, which I love, which is fantastic. And this is one of the Gollancz binaries. They didn't do many of these, and these were in the 90s. Oh yeah, I got Ken to sign this for me when I hosted him a while ago. Another glare-like signature you can't see there. And A Writer's Life is very much sort of a almost supernatural story about a writer and a quasi-haunted house. And Paul de Filippo said, you know, that this was great evocations of the British landscape, and there were sort of moments which reminded him of Christopher Priest, of Graham Joyce, Robert Holstock. And yeah, and this isn't bad. So there's a couple of Eric's things. So, but I see he's done loads and loads of others. I am thinking of repicking a few more back up, because I do quite fancy reading some more of his stuff, because it's always entertaining, if not of the front rank quality. So that was Eric, and he was like the first out of the traps, as it were, and his stuff was the first to sort of get some attention. So if you're looking out for his work, maybe you want to try the first short story collection, Time Lapse Man. That gives you an idea of what was getting published in Interzone at that time. And it was a very diverse magazine. There's all sorts of things in there. Really, really good. So somebody else who came along pretty early in the days of the magazine with short stories again was somebody who became a massive star, and that's Stephen Baxter. And this is Raft, which is his first novel. This was published around about 1990 as a Gollancz hardcover, as a Grafton hardcover with the same cover. It's actually got this on the design of the Masterwork edition. And, you know, Stephen obviously very influenced by people like Arthur C. Clarke and the sort of hard SF guys. And I remember reading his early Zeely stories in Interzone, and they didn't make much of an impression on me, I have to say. I didn't really think they were exciting, they were quite dull. And I haven't really revised my opinion. I did an event with Stephen once in Swansea in 1999, and he's a really nice guy, you know, he's a lovely guy, and you know, everybody thinks he's a great guy, but his work never really worked for me. But I'm not much in this sort of vein. But if you like Arthur C. Clarke and big dumb objects and mysterious alien artifacts and stuff, and you know, proper hard physics, then Stephen's your man. He really is. But I've got this because, you know, I have very fond memories of these days, and it was good to see a new generation coming along. Even though they were upsetting me by doing a lot of the space opera stuff, I wanted more sort of, you know, slipstream, on the edge, difficult, literary, is it SF, is it not, near future stuff, because that's very much my jam, you know. So I guess, you know, they were sort of a new generation of gene rats, upsetting the expectations of old new wave guys like me. And I wasn't an old guy then, I was a young guy, of course. So yeah, Stephen obviously went out to an amazing career. He's in tons and tons of books. He really has pushed it out there. Still has major deals. He had a new book out very recently, so which I sold as soon as it came in. I sold it, you know. It was great stuff. So one of those things. So yeah, Stephen was also very prominent. So Eric and Stephen were like the first two, as it were. The next writer to cause a sort of splash in Interzone, and who seemed to get some attention, and he sort of comeback stories very soon, was Paul J. Macaulay. And I've just reread actually this collection. This is Paul's first collection. This is The King of the Hill, published by Gollancz around about 1990. And I read some of these in Interzone at the time. The one I really remember is Carl and the Ogre, which I actually hated. I really didn't like it. And I thought, why are people going on about this guy? But I've reread these stories, and some of them are in other magazines, and they're mostly really, really good. And the title story, which has a kind of Arthurian thing and a near future Britain thing, I really loved that. I thought it was fantastic. It's great to go back to it again. And it's very well written. I think, to be fair, I think I've been unkind to Paul. Things I've said in the past about him, just in conversation and stuff. And it's really good. So I'm actually going to revisit some of his novels, and I'm really looking forward to them because I really enjoyed this. Wonderful story in here called Transcendence, which is a very hard SF story set on Venus, where somebody is there on the planet's surface. They've been there quite some time. They've got calcium loss, and the science is really realistic, and they project their consciousness into like a robot type cyborg machine so they can do their research and what have you. And there's other people there as well, and the guy knows he'll never get back to Earth because his body simply couldn't cope with the gravity and things. And it's really, really good, you know. And there's a lot of stories have a common background, and there's something about them in terms of the way that, you know, people who work in space and they're on bases and what have you, and different planets and moons and things like that, and they, it does remind me a little bit of Delaney's I and Gomorrah, and the writing's very good. I'm not going to say it's like I and Gomorrah, or it's as good as Delaney, because it's not. That wouldn't be true. But it's strong, muscular stuff, good storytelling, nice prose. So I am looking forward to reading more Paul stuff again. But if you see this, pick it up. There's some really good stories in it. The King of the Hill by Paul J. Macaulay. But I still didn't like Carl and the Yoga. But there you go. It is what it is. But yeah, so he's an amazing career as well. He's got a new book out now. Keeps sort of producing very interesting looking hard SF novels. He's a biologist. He's also lots of physics in his work. I met him once very briefly when I was invited to the Friends and Family showing of The Prestige back in 2006. And I remember him saying about, there was a review of one of somebody's books where they talk about a scientist being a villain, and he said, he said, be fed up with this. He said, scientists are good guys, and because he's a good guy. So Paul, you are a good guy. I am going to reread some more of your work, and as I say, do pick this up, guys, because this is good. And looking back at the people I've mentioned so far from the Gene Rats, and these are kind of the core people, I do think he's the best, actually. So there we go. So Paul J. Macaulay, the King of the Hill. So I'm actually going to take Eric off there and put Paul in Pride of Place. And I do like these rather dark Golax jackets. There's a similar one for Stalin's Teardrops by Ian Watson, same sort of time. Handsome stuff, it really is. So, as I say, the person who sort of kicked all this off was Colin Greenland. And, Colin had a good college try to get this sort of label going, but it never really took off. And here's another one of Colin's books, Daybreak on a Different Mountain, which is another one of his fantasy books published by Unwin. And I'm just showing you this because Unwin's books from this period are just so beautiful. They really are lovely. Really great stuff. And I did a very memorable event for Unwin back in '89 with M. John Harrison and Gary Kilworth. And it was for M. John's book Climbers, which was Golax. But I tied in the paperbacks because M. John's paperbacks were then with Unwin and Gary Kilworth was with Unwin. And Gary had done an anthropomorphic fantasy about foxes and a couple of sequels, and they were great. And Jane Johnson, now of HarperCollins and a novelist in her own right for many, many years, she sometimes writes as Jude Fisher. She and Mike were in a relationship then. And she and Mike stayed at my house, or my flat, with me and the video widow. And Gary stayed next door, my mate Jim, who was the Unwin rep. And we had a really great event. Lots of people turned up. It was excellent. And both Gary and Mike gave fantastic readings. They're lovely guys. We went to have a really nice Indian meal afterwards. And it was one of the most fun nights of my life as a bookseller. It was really good there to sit with Mike. And he's absolutely charming. And Gary's self-facing guy was brilliant. So that's something I remember really well from those times. And as I say, not about Colin Greenland, but something that the Colin did. So that's the Unwin connection coming in. Back in 1990, I'm going back to this, was he wrote this. And this is the HarperCollins A format from about 91. This is a big book, and this is a space opera. There were 2 sequels, which I've never read because I'm not big on series. I'm not big on space opera, but this was sort of like rollicking fun. It won the BSFA award for best science fiction novel, and it's got a lady of colour as the central character who's called Tabitha Jute. And it starts on Mars, and as Moorcock says in the cover, a great big magnificent galaxy shaking plot that will make you forget to eat and sleep. And you can see the influence of things like Norman Spinrad, Alfred Bester. It's great stuff. Stableford maybe. So if you like a good space opera that's well written and it's very knockabout and witty, you should get this. And it's in Golax's masterwork and has been for ages. Now Colin these days, his fame is rather what fame he had. He's never famous. He was eclipsed rather by Susanna Clarke, his partner, who wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and Piranesi and Ladies of Grace Adieu and stuff. But this is well worth picking up. So if you're the sort of guy like me who's not keen on space opera, but now and again you like a really well written one, pick this up. It's great, really, really good. And I do love that. The A format, they don't make them like that anymore. That's the trouble. So I sort of fell out of love with Interzone. A lot of these new writers say never really grabbed me big time. And recently I read one who I hadn't really read at the time. Maybe I read some of the shorts. I have no memory of them. And that's Keith Brooke. And this is Keepers of the Peace, which is Keith's first novel. And I got this from Zardoz or News Books recently and gave it a try. And, you get an instinct when you work in the book trade, when you work around books, of what you're going to like. And maybe it was based on the short stories. And I never bought this at the time. I picked this up very cheap from Morris at Zardoz. And I have to say, I really didn't think much of it at all. I do have another one of Keith's books which looks more interesting. This is Expatria, and there was a sequel to this as well. Now Keith is still active, and he's done some co-writing of things with Eric Brown, funnily enough. They've done a fair amount of stuff with PS and New Con, and they keep going. And he was very young when he wrote these. He was something like 20, 22. So you have to admire that, you know. So he has some sort of mojo going on. But isn't that beautiful? Really, really lovely. So that is something I'm going to give a go to. I've only acquired that relatively recently, so I'm going to give that a try. So apologies if I missed, if any of the Gene Rats are watching this. And there were other people in Interzone. There were female writers like Rachel Pollack and Mary Gentle and what have you, and lots of others. But those are the sort of people I think of as the Gene Rats. The sort of key people to me were Eric Brown, Stephen Baxter, Paul J. Macaulay, and Colin Greenland tried to sort of bring it all together. But it was a revolution that never took off, or rather it was a tag which never took off. It was a subgenre, it was a name, it was a label. And that was the problem, that was all it was. It was really hard to try and pin these guys down because they were all different. There was, though, more of an emphasis on hard SF, less so in Eric's work, I would say. Obviously, very much in Stephen's work, and in Paul's work, there was the hard SF thing. But there was also the literary thing, which is where somebody like Gregory Benford comes in, somebody who knows the lessons of the new wave. So, you know, so there was that sort of hybridization of new wave and hard SF. And that had been going on in America since the mid-70s. So I guess this was the time it came into Britain. And things moved on, and of course Baxter became a star. Banks, you know, sort of blew everybody out of the water, and really that was the sort of beginning of the end for me. And by the sort of, you know, early 90s, 93 or so, I was really fed up with SF because I felt a lot of the more literary, more interesting things weren't happening. And this is why I did a 90s TBR recently, and soon I'll be shooting a video once I've read a few more books about my reaction looking back, about whether my instinct about whether the 90s was not a great time for SF or not comes back. And I think, if I'm honest, generally speaking, I do think since that time SF's been in a long, slow decline with the odd flash of genius. So when I do talk more about the 90s, I will not only talk about the genre SF, but the stuff which has been published in the mainstream, which is actually SF, because there's been some significant books in the 90s onwards, which are clearly SF, but they've never been marketed as such. So those are the Gene Rats. So, you know, if you fancy it, give them a try. Try and think of them in the same context, the same time. If you look at their early work, if you look at Raft, you look at Eric's really early sort of short stories and Paul's early stuff. And I will be reading more Paul's stuff. So those are the Gene Rats. Let me know if you remember that issue of Interzone as well, because I couldn't tell you which one it was in. I'll probably dig a bit deeper and find it. I'll ask David or something. So this is me on a Saturday afternoon. It's sunny. I've had my COVID jab. I thought I'd feel dreadful. I actually feel okay. I'm going to sign out for now, and I've got to decide what I'm going to read next, which is a real struggle, isn't it? So like, subscribe, comment, super thanks if you want. And here's the end of another chaotic roundup of SF nonsense. Bye for now.